context, it's the political story, the human story behind Dewey Defeats Truman, one of the most compelling, interesting, and provocative headlines in all of journalistic history, at least in the United States history. And so I want to kind of tell the backstory, the human story of this amazing headline from the perspective of President Truman and also the perspective of Colonel McCormick. And so while we're waiting here for the slide to load, I do apologize for the delay there. Okay, I think it's starting to go a little more quickly there. Very good. This is the iconic headline. This is a headline that we feature in our new museum exhibit at the Truman Presidential Library. We recently undertook a $30 million renovation of the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. And one of the big features is our telling of the Whistle Stop campaign, which I'll say more about here. And we feature this photograph that I'll say much more about later. But it's known to anyone familiar with American political history. Basically, what's interesting about that headline, most obviously, is that it is wrong. And the Chicago Tribune was not alone in its errors. Poll after poll leading up to the November 1948 election had Thomas Dewey, the Republican nominee for president, ahead of incumbent sitting president Harry S. Truman. And you see there some of the statistics there, some of the polls. The National Press Club voted 50-1 for Dewey. The Who's Who 1949 edition listed Dewey's address as 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, which is the White House. Experts and of all kinds, journalists, political experts, pundits, all had the smart money on Thomas Dewey. And these are just, I won't read all these in the interest of time, but it kind of gives you a real strong indication of that poll after poll was basically wrong. And what happened is the essential problem is that polling stopped about 2 weeks prior to the election. And the race actually had been tightening during that period of time, but I'll say more about that later. Historian Zachary Karabell, who's written a book about the 1948 campaign there, kind of provides some of the context for this refers to the grievances and pent-up tensions that were going to be released during the 1948 campaign, which was the first one after the end of World War II. I think that's very important to note. World War II, one of the most momentous events in all of world history, a conflict that cost the lives of over 60 million people around the world and hundreds of thousands of Americans. About 12 to 15 million men and women had served in uniform during World War II. And Harry Truman became president toward the end of that war, end of World War II in 1945. And he served about 3.5 years and was running for re-election here election in his own right in 1948. There were all kinds of stresses and conflicts that I'll say more about in a little while. But among them here that Karabell addresses is this so-called breakup of the New Deal. The labor was unhappy with high prices and with the Taft-Hartley Act. There was discontent among African Americans and conflict with Southern Democrats. And I'll say more about that in a little while. Big city boss power is declining. So all of this is the context. Big city power, including in the city of Chicago. Although Chicago had a very important role to play in the 1944 nomination of then Senator Harry S. Truman to become vice president. The big city powers of New York, Chicago, and also in New Jersey had very strong influence in 1944, but it was beginning to wane. And of course, you have the world context of the emerging Cold War and the Soviet Union and its menace. Here's a couple of cartoons from our collection here that kind of talks about that. the election and the lead up to that election. And here's another one. And again, these come from our collection, and they're just basically kind of talking about how long the odds were against sitting president Harry Truman. Flash forward to July 1948 in the Democratic National Convention. To say that Harry Truman energized this convention hall in Philadelphia is an understatement. Thomas Dewey had his own convention in Philadelphia a little while earlier. And again, Dewey's strategy was to play it safe. Harry Truman came out fighting. And despite long delays and a very hot convention hall in July, he came in the early wee hours of the morning in July to really energize the crowd. Now they were the faithful, of course. They were Democrats as well, but he really was one of the only people really that thought he would win. And his speech that night really electrified the convention and set the tone for his forthcoming national campaign. The Democratic National Committee created this cartoon, which is a comic book that we actually have in our collections here, and it is a very kind of a fun read that tells Harry Truman's biography and his rise in Jackson County, which is the Kansas City area, and his rise in politics and his eventual ascension to the U.S. Senate and the vice presidency. Now, of course, it doesn't talk about some of the seamier sides of Kansas City politics in the 1920s and 30s in which Truman emerged, particularly the rise of the Pendergast machine, that is the machine of Thomas Pendergast, who was an Irish Catholic politician and Harry Truman's political patron, really in every way. And it was really as a result of Pendergast's support that Harry Truman was able to rise in politics from precinct to president, at least in the precinct level in eastern Jackson County, and then as a kind of a county commissioner in Jackson County, and then a rise to the U.S. Senate. And anyway, this is a fun comic book. I'm just showing you a couple pages from it. But this was an effort for public relations, which has a very different tone and feel than it does today. A lot less money was put into what we call public relations. Harry Truman had little money in his campaign coffers, which makes his victory even more striking and significant. Thomas Dewey and Earl Warren were kind of an unlikely political couple, but they were known as a dream team in many ways. Dewey was a former New York governor and a famous prosecutor of mafia figures, and had been the nominee for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1944. And again, when that failed, he was defeated by Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. He ran again in 1948 and chose as his running mate Earl Warren, who would later become Chief Justice of the United States and the justice during some very important decisions in Supreme Court history, not least of which was the Brown versus Board of Education, the Topeka Board of Education decision during the Eisenhower years. But Warren himself was governor of California, and both men were seen as moderates, even as kind of progressive moderates on the Republican side. They had significant differences with Harry Truman in the areas of domestic policy. But on foreign policy, they largely supported the Truman foreign policy. But they were seen as fresh faces. Democrats had controlled the White House since 1933. Franklin Roosevelt had served 12 years as president of the United States until his sudden death in April of 1945, when Harry Truman became president. So during that period of almost would have been 15 years, from 1933 to 1948, Democrats controlled the White House. So that was another reason why the smart money was on the Republicans, because they were seen as fresh faces. Let's clean house. Let's start anew. There was a brief meeting here on the campaign trail between President Truman there on the left and Thomas Dewey there on the right. and a cordial meeting. And again, Dewey's tone of his campaign was play it safe. We basically have this in the bag. Let's not do anything to rock the boat too many times. I'm using a lot of metaphors here, but and so the pressure was seen as being on President Truman, and so Truman really took a much more aggressive kind of approach to his campaigning as opposed to the play it safe. Picture there of Dewey with his family, and there at the convention in 1948. Dewey was an innocuous-looking figure. Ridiculed him as looking like a little man on the wedding cake. With his mustache and very neat manner and courteous demeanor, and he was seen as a likable figure. Again, Dewey had his own campaign train called the Dewey Victory Special. And he took his train on a much more shortened version of what Harry Truman undertook, which was a much larger, was referred to as a whistle stop campaign. And there's a very awkward looking PR photo there on the left. Truman faced not only the opposition of his Republican opponent, Thomas Dewey, but a split within his own party, which was split three ways, remarkably. We had Truman as the nominee, but then on his right, he faced a challenge from Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond, senator from South Carolina. The Dixiecrats, also known as the States' Rights Party, actually had split off from the Democrats over civil rights. They were unhappy with the progressive stand of Truman and Truman's desegregation of the armed forces order, his executive order desegregating the armed forces, a civil rights statement that Truman had made, a speech before the NAACP, and numerous other things that Truman had done for civil rights, coming at a time when there was relatively little constituency for civil rights, unlike in the 1960s. Other than maybe A. Philip Randolph and a handful of other leaders, African-American leaders, there was no Martin Luther King Jr., to sort of motivate civil rights. But Harry Truman did it basically because he felt it was the right thing to do. And I'd like that could be an entirely different subject for another evening, Truman and civil rights. But suffice it to say, it split the Democratic Party. Strom Thurmond felt that this was a states' rights issue, that is civil rights, and one not that the federal government could sort of keep its hands off of. Let the states take care of the civil rights issue. This is a cartoon showing that civil rights message that Truman gave, proclaim liberty across the land. You see kind of the determined look on Truman's face in this Herb Block cartoon. Truman as a bell ringer. And it caused quite a stir in the Democratic Party. And it resulted in a desegregation of the armed forces, mostly during the Truman administration, but then complete during his successor, the Eisenhower administration. Each branch of the military was more or less on board with integration. But the Korean War, which had started in 1950, was the first war to feature integrated troops. That is units with integrated troops. And then here's Truman speaking in 1947, as I say, before the NAACP to about 10,000 people. That's Truman's opposition on the right, as we would say. His opposition on the left took the form of Henry Wallace, who, again, a very interesting fellow. He's shown there seated. I don't know if you can see my little arrow there pointing at him, and that's folk singer Woody Guthrie. But that's Wallace there in the center holding the child. And Wallace, a fascinating figure, kind of largely forgotten today, but Wallace felt that Truman was too aggressive and truculent on foreign policy. That is, that he felt that Truman's foreign policy was that of a warmonger, that we would get into a third world war with the Soviet Union as a result of Truman's foreign policy. And there was a bit of sour grapes here too, because Henry Wallace had been the vice president during Franklin Roosevelt's third term as president from 1940 to 1944, but Roosevelt dumped him in favor of Truman. So I think there was a little bit of sour grapes there a little bit. Wallace had served as Truman's Secretary of Commerce, but they had a falling out over foreign policy. So that's the three-way split in the Democratic Party. You have Harry Truman in the center, so more or less, so to speak. You have Henry Wallace running on his left, and then Strom Thurmond running to the right. So that siphoned off votes off of Truman, in the 1948 election. And Wallace was a farmer, so he had connections with farmers. He was from Iowa, the state of Iowa, which is a big corn agriculture state. This is him sitting with a farmer. Now, the Democrats huddled, that is, the men, and they were all men, surrounding Truman, with the important exception of Bess Wallace Truman, his wife, who was an important confidant and advisor herself. But the people outside of Truman's family circle, were all men. So they would gather in what's called the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington, D.C., and they came up with a campaign strategy on how to conduct the 1948 campaign. They determined, according to this was called the Roe Memorandum, that was kind of their blueprint, for the campaign. Dewey would be the nominee in 1948, that is their opponent. That Henry Wallace would run as a third-party candidate, which is exactly what happened. Truman was moved to the left on social domestic issues. Pressure groups will influence the vote outcome instead of the political machines. Again, they have notable exception where in Chicago, where the machine was still very powerful. The key pressure groups voting blocks to court were farmers, labor underscored, progressives, racial groups, especially Northern blacks. Ignore Southern protests against civil rights. They can't pull out. Even if they do, the loss will not affect a Truman victory. Now, that was a very, very risky strategy that almost cost them, but it turned out okay. Bipartisan foreign policy will come under stress, and the two main issues of the domestic issues will be consumer prices and housing. Congress will not cooperate to pass your social legislation. Roe commented, I do not know whether Mr. Truman would be elected if everything in this memo were done to perfection, but I do know that if no attempt is made, us Democrats ain't got a chance in that. So Truman takes the campaign trail. Very, very vigorous, very energetic, very underfunded campaign trip. Let's say numerous trips, actually, that Truman took crisscrossing the country from east to west. And it's fascinating to see a map. I should probably have included a map in this presentation. There's only so much I can ground it can cover, unfortunately. But he largely skipped the deep south because he realized that, that was pretty much, he figured he'd win kind of most of the votes by default, because at that time, most of the American South was still Democratic, part of the Democrat Party, I should say. We did not see the shift that we've seen in subsequent years to more of a Republican stronghold. So Truman felt in part that, yes, he would lose some votes, but he could kind of, getting back to that Roe Memorandum, kind of consider the South as kind of safely more or less in the bag. So this is the campaign train that Truman took. He wanted to get out and see the people. Truman was one of the last of the old style politicians. He was a pre-television president. Television was in its infancy during his presidency, though, which lasted from 1945 to 1953. Very few Americans had televisions in 1948, but the 1948 campaign was the first to be televised. So television was in its infancy. Truman was not a very good set speaker of speeches. He had kind of a stiff approach, and his voice was kind of reflected that. But when he got out among the people, when he got to press the flesh, so to speak, his real personality came through. He had a very retentive mind. He could remember the important people and politicians in the various places he went. And he really made an impression on people, particularly his vigor, his give 'em hell Harry tone. He would have kind of a fiery kind of manner on the campaign trail. And this is a cartoon that kind of shows the the difference in tone between the two. That cartoon on the left really kind of summarizes it there. And this is a picture from one of those whistle stops. They weren't, obviously, some of them weren't very large towns and cities he stopped in. They just would happen to have a train depot. But he also stopped in bigger cities too, notably in Chicago. And on the foreign policy front, there's a lot going on. And I don't have too much time to get into this very much, but one of the big conflicts at the time was what was called the Berlin Airlift, when the Soviet Union blockaded routes into the city of Berlin. Now, Berlin is a city in Germany, of course, and you think, well, how can the Soviets have any influence there? Well, Berlin was a city in Germany, but it was deep within the heart of East Germany, which was controlled politically by the Soviets. They were able to block land and rail and sea access to the city. And the reasons for that are too much to get into, unfortunately. But Harry Truman decided that we need to do something for the people of Berlin, because the risk was that they might starve and be denied provisions. Couldn't trade, couldn't get supplies in and out of the city. So Truman organized an airlift, or approved an airlift, that resulted in hundreds of thousands of flights in and out of the city of Berlin during a year-long period. So during this 1948 campaign, you had this blockade occurring in Europe. Again, a time of great tension. But Truman, smiling there, with his wife on the far left there, that's Bess, and in the middle, Margaret, which was their only child. She was 24 years old at the time of this photo. And she and Bess accompanied Truman on the campaign trail. Bess Truman had a kind of a laid back kind of style. She was preferred to be behind the scenes as an advisor. She did not like headlines. She did not like the public spotlight. She was very, very important and influential as a kind of a unseen partner of President Truman. And here's a campaign stop in a small community in Kansas, kind of gets you a sense of the size of the crowds. And people began to notice the crowds for Truman were getting larger. Now, at one point, during the this was 1947, actually. This is a year before. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but this is an actual diary entry from Truman's diary, when Truman relates a conversation he had with Dwight Eisenhower, basically offering Eisenhower the nomination as president in 1948. Okay, so this is a sitting president, Harry Truman, offering the nomination that next year, 1948, to Eisenhower. He wanted to escape the White House, or the Great White Jail, known as the White House. That is, Truman did not like the presidency very much. But that kind of tells you the kind of feelings Truman had. So he kind of, the job was huge. It's a big job for anyone, particularly that period, those years after World War II. But Truman decided, when Eisenhower turned down his offer, he's going to make the best of it. He wants to win in his own right in 1948. And one of his last campaign stops was in Independence, Missouri, the site of our presidential library. Truman's running mate was a man named Alben Barkley, senator from the state of Kentucky. Himself considered at one point a possible presidential candidate. But he was in advanced years in 1948, but he seemed like a good bet for the vice presidency. They were close politically, Harry Truman and Alben Barkley. Barkley was a good asset to Truman. I wouldn't say he added a whole lot of positives, but he had almost no negatives, and so he was a good, a safe bet. Very competent man, and for the vice presidency. Truman liked regular reporters, and I'll say more about that later. He liked the reporters that were on the ground, so to speak, that got the story, that would interview him. He had a good rapport with them. He even was honorary member of the One More Club. That is an informal photography club of photographers at the White House, where Truman at one point took the camera himself, videotaped a squirrel running across the grounds there at the White House. So, Truman had a manner with them where he liked reporters themselves. Publishers, a different story, which we'll say more about in a little while. But they accompanied Truman on his campaign trail. And here's an election parade that's anticipating, this is Truman's hometown, of course, anticipating a success for the hometown hero, Harry Truman. Truman came to independence on the eve of the election and actually voted in independence. And that's a picture of the Harry, Bess, and Margaret voting in the booth in independence on election day, November 2nd, 1948. And Truman, looking confident, emerging from the voting booth. Truman himself predicted he would win the election, and this is proof. And I unfortunately don't have time to get into this very much, but just suffice it to say, this is Truman's electoral prediction of the states he would win. That is the ones in the so-called white column. The states he thought he would lose in the so-called black column. That is Thomas Dewey would win in his estimation. And the states that he thought were in the red, and those would be the ones that he thought Strom Thurmond was going to win. And then there's doubtful. And then for some reason, he just didn't mention Utah. But there were 48 states at that time, and he just had to, And what's remarkable about this is he remembered the number of electoral votes and dictated this to an aide aboard the campaign trail. What's important here is his upper left corner here. He estimated he'd win 340 electoral votes. He ended up winning, I believe, 380. So he was very close, and he believed he would win. And this shows here I guess it was 303, according to this chart, electoral votes. And that's the actual vote results. The state of Illinois went for President Truman, as did a lot of the Midwest and the West. Truman lost a lot of the Northeast. Of course, New York was Thomas Dewey's home state. The upper and the central Midwest, Truman lost, as well as the South. And that's just showing another way to present it there. Truman won almost 50% of the vote, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it, basically a four-way race. And so in the post-election here, you said the sad-looking Republican elephant, wondering what the heck happened here. So Truman, the day after the election, is going back east toward Washington, and someone hands him a newspaper aboard his campaign train. It's a copy of the early edition of the Chicago Tribune. And Truman's in this picture holding up that headline that reads something opposite of what happens. It said, "Dewey defeats Truman." And here he is aboard the campaign trail. And the man on the far left there, standing with him on the left, our left, is Bernard Dickman, who was the mayor of St. Louis. So this is a campaign stop in St. Louis. And much to Truman's delight, someone hands him that newspaper. And a competitor across town, the Chicago Daily Sun-Times, has fun with the Chicago Tribune's headline. Shows a picture of Truman holding up the Tribune headline. This is a picture we received recently of that Times headline, having kind of poking fun at the crosstown rival. But the Chicago Tribune, as I say before, is not the only one that got it wrong. So what's the story really behind the headline? I've really talked a lot about the context background for the election itself, and I mentioned, that Truman liked working reporters. He had a good rapport with them. He the working journalists. He really enjoyed their company, liked talking to them. Well, what's interesting in particularly this story is the Robert McCormick angle. Now, to say that Truman, and HST is Harry S. Truman, that Truman and McCormick had a strong mutual dislike is certainly true. It was largely over politics. Now, both men had served during World War I, so they would have had a lot to chat about under different circumstances, and maybe it would have even been friends under different circumstances. But McCormick, very, very conservative, a supporter of Robert Taft, actually, a senator from Ohio. McCormick supported Taft for the nomination in 1948. He was not a big Dewey fan, but Truman was unpalatable, a warmonger, coddler of communists, and a political hack. And of course, McCormick also disliked the Marshall Plan, which was a large-scale, massive aid to Europe after World War II. Now, for Truman, McCormick's Tribune was the worst newspaper in the country, skilled in character assassination. McCormick himself was a right-wing crackpot. Source there is Richard Norton Smith's very nice, wonderful new book, The Colonel, which I have a copy of right here, which many of you in the audience are probably familiar with, published by Northwestern University Press. And again, the author is Richard Norton Smith, The Colonel, a biography of the life and legend of Robert R. McCormick. Just came out here recently. Now, McCormick was not alone in his disdain for Mr. Truman, who was unpopular with most newspaper editors. According to this source, he was endorsed by about 15% of the nation's newspapers, which in Truman's view, most of those newspapers were controlled by rich Republican elite owners who were predisposed to dislike Truman anyway. Now, as I say before, Truman and McCormick on the surface had some things in common. Both had served in the Army in World War I. They both had an interest in agriculture. Mr. Truman had been a farmer. Mr. McCormick supported experimental farms on his estate in Wheaton, Illinois. My host here, Chris Corrigan, pointed that out to me the other day. I thought it was very interesting. I did not know that. Neither man was a fan of Thomas Dewey. And as I mentioned, McCormick preferred Robert Taft for the nomination. Now, the main cast of characters, and this is it's a very interesting story that's been covered elsewhere, but the main cast of characters in the Dewey Defeats Truman headline itself was, of course, Robert Birdie McCormick, managing editor J. Lloyd Pat Maloney, and Washington correspondent Arthur Sears Henning. Okay, and for a lot of details on that, you can see The Colonel by Richard Norton Smith devotes a lot of time to this famous headline. But there's a very interesting book written by a reporter named Walter Trohan, who succeeded Henning as a bureau chief. And it's always the Monday morning quarterbacking is always easy, right? He said that his predecessor Henning should have qualified his story, as I did mine, saying that Republicans were leading in the early returns, which they were. Instead, Maloney arched his neck and grew more stubborn. Trohan claimed that Henning wrote his Dewey headline before 9 a.m. on election morning, without qualification, without hedging, without saying, well, Dewey's ahead, which would have been perfectly fair to say, well before the polls closed. City editor of the Tribune, Don Maxwell, changed the headline at about midnight after Maloney left the office. Trohan claimed that his stories were, quote, dug out of the wastebasket, and he rewrote the victory story to make it Truman's triumph. The next day, he reports that Colonel McCormick replaced Henning with Trohan as the bureau chief. And that's a source from Trohan's book, Political Animals. And what's important is happening here that, the later headlines included, GOP wins White House. That is, the Tribune qualified changed its headline several times. Later headlines were GOP wins White House, Dewey ahead, race close, Democrats winning state. But the headline that everyone remembered was Dewey defeats Truman. There was a newspaper strike going on at the time at the Chicago Tribune. And that newspaper strike was a printer strike. And it really paralyzed and slowed down the publication of the newspaper. So the timing of the 1948 election was really unfortunate for the Tribune. So Henning really felt pressure, to Maloney felt pressure to get that issue out very quickly, because it took more time to set the printing press. This was before the era of computers. And so everything had to be done manually. So you had workers that were not very experienced setting the print. And in fact, if you look at the actual newspaper, the actual Dewey Defeats Truman newspaper, you don't look at the headline. You look at the far right column. It's upside down, which was because it was in such a rush to get to print. And the other thing is Maloney really trusted Henning. Henning was the dean of reporters in Washington, D.C. He was the Washington bureau chief for the. And Maloney trusted Henning's judgment. Henning said, go with Dewey. It's a safe bet. Go with him for our headline. Okay, so Maloney trusted that judgment, as many people would. And so, that's kind of some of the background behind the story as well. Now, you think, well, why did it matter? It seems like an innocent mistake. Well, newspapers and radios were much more a source for information than even television, which, as I mentioned, most households did not have in 1948. This is the pre-internet, pre-social media age. Newspapers were really important. In fact, the very next day, the story is McCormick asked people to rush out to the streets and recover as many of those unsold Dewey Defeats Truman early editions as he could. He didn't want them to get in the hands of people. He wanted to grab them and throw them away. And as the Tribune itself noted about a year ago, it was arguably the most famous headline in the newspaper's history. There was a lot of soul searching after the 1948 election. I don't really have time to say too much about it. It was a bland, uninspired, overconfident Dewey campaign effort. Many Republican voters stayed home, confident that Dewey would win. Farm vote ended up probably being the number one reason, why Truman remained in the White House. And what's kind of fun is to examine what was called a Pullet poll, which was a grain bags. And basically what this is kind of an informal poll. It wasn't anything scientific. It was basically this company called the Staling Milling Company that is feed bags bought by farmers. And what they found is the stack of Truman bags was a lot lower than the stack of Dewey ones. That is, more people were buying the Truman ones by 54 to 46%. So it's kind of an unscientific way of kind of saying, oh gosh, farmers are more interested in supporting Truman. And I wish I had time to get into too much of this. This is a kind of a story of how Truman ended up winning. I know we're getting close to the end here, so I want to kind of wrap up my time so I can take some questions. But the farm vote ended up being very key, despite the split in the Democratic Party. And importantly, Life magazine got it wrong too. The next president travels by ferry boat over the broad waters of San Francisco Bay. That's Life magazine, referring to, I don't know if you can read, that's the small print I read there in the lower left corner there, referring to Thomas Dewey, and that's his wife there. But that's the next president travels by ferry boat. Life magazine, very well read national magazine in 1948. The Washington Post, now notably not the Tribune, but the Post, invited Truman to a figurative banquet, which Post staff would eat crow for being wrong about the election. Truman replied that he did not want anyone to eat crow. Instead, everyone in the country should be able to eat turkey whenever they like. So Truman was very gracious. He did not say mean things about McCormick. He did not say mean things about the Tribune. He certainly thought mean things, but he did not act on those toward the Tribune or the numerous other newspapers that predicted his defeat in 1948. And then Truman takes the oath of office in January 1949 and serves a full term until through 1952. Now, I'll say real quickly as I'm wrapping up here, the Truman Library I mentioned before has undergone a very large renovation, $30+ million. And as you see there, featured there in our new exhibit, the Dewey Defeats Truman banner headline that's in our new exhibit. This photo here, I kind of like this photo. It's taken just before we finished our renovation. We were still kind of working on things as not quite open yet. Actually, technically, we're still not open. We opened for 3 weeks in July, and then when COVID cases got higher in the Kansas City area, we closed again, but we're hoping to open again very soon. For more reading, there's several good books for the 1948 election, including those by Zachary Karabell, as I mentioned before, and A.J. Baime, B-A-I-M-E. And you might also watch the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum episode from season 13, episode 7, which was dedicated to the Dewey Defeats Truman headline and told the story of McCormick, Sears, and Henning, as hosted in that segment by yours truly. So with that, I will be happy to turn this over for questions.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was an amazing lecture, and I loved all the great. I loved when you held up the copy of the Colonel. I did not ask him to do that, anybody, and I was like, oh look. I really fast want to point out one of our guests just wanted to let you know that they went to the museum during the renovation, and they think the renovation is beautiful, and they are very excited to go back, and that it is a wonderful place to go. So I just wanted to throw out that compliment that you can bring back to the rest of your team.
Thank you. Thank you.
We do already have a couple of questions that came in during the course of the presentation. If anyone has any others that they're marrying on, don't hesitate, throw them in the Q&A. But Sam, I'll ask you a couple of the ones that had come in while you were speaking. The first one we got was, when and where did Truman serve in the armed forces?
Oh, yeah, great question. Truman served in the armed forces in 1917 until his discharge in early 1919. So he served during World War I. He served in France as an artillery captain. He was in charge of about 200 men and large guns. And he was at the Meuse-Argonne offensive and the San Miguel salient and the Vosges Mountains. You know, he saw real combat. In fact, he was the only president of the United States that saw combat during World War I.
I have to laugh at that, specifically because him and Robert had such, they didn't like each other, because Robert was a colonel in France in artillery during World War I. He was just at Cantini, which is obviously why we're named Cantini, but that parallel is, to me, absolutely hilarious.
Well, it's interesting because they might have been within a few miles of each other at one point. Now, Truman was a captain. He rose to the rank of captain. But that's very interesting that the two men would have had a lot to chat about in different circumstances.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Our next question, I like the way this one was worded, very funny to me. Why was Mr. Republican Robert Taft, who would have offered the sharpest policy contrast to Truman and thus likely to have run a more aggressive campaign, not seen as a better nominee than Dewey?
That's an excellent question. I think it tended to be because it was Dewey's, the Republican Party felt they owed it to Dewey. He had run and gotten close to winning in 1948. He was an experienced campaigner. And the other part is that I think the Republicans sort of felt like it really doesn't matter too much who we're putting up against Truman. Truman had lost his party, the Democrats had lost resoundingly the off-year elections in 1946. And so Republicans looked at that and said, let's not put out anybody that's too divisive. Let's put out somebody that's more of a unifying force in the form of Thomas Dewey, because the Democrats and Truman are going to self-destruct. Truman is not a very effective campaigner, as it was seen. They could see his party was split. Let's go with the safe bet. Plus, we kind of owe it to Dewey because he was our nominee in 1944. But that's a very interesting observation. And yeah, that same Richard Norton Smith has written a book, as you may know, about Robert Taft, which you might want to take a look at. But yeah, that's a very interesting observation. And Taft, or even more likely, Eisenhower would have been a very good nominee for the Republicans in 1948. Eisenhower ended up being the nominee in 1952, as you may know, and then won two overwhelming victories.
So do you think that, like, specifically running against Truman, Eisenhower would have been like a really strong choice, or just in general?
Yeah, I do. Now that diary entry I showed you, actually showed that, Truman was friendly with Eisenhower and done a lot for his campaign, or excuse me, for his career, a lot for Eisenhower's career. But Eisenhower at this point was sort of unknown. He was an unknown political quantity. Is a Democrat? Is he a Republican? He never declared either way. And so both sides were kind of courting Eisenhower. So I think Eisenhower would have been a powerful, and would have been elected very likely if he'd run as a Democrat or a Republican in 1948.
We have another question. How did Dewey's electoral vote total against Truman compare to his total against Roosevelt?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that offhand. That's a very good question. I could hazard a guess.
Hazard a guess.
Hazard guess.
We all accept that Sam is hazarding a guess here.
Yes.
In fact, but
I think he did better against Truman, though, honestly. I could go back and double check that, but I think he did do a little better against Truman. But Roosevelt was a formidable force to run against. I mean, he had won 4 elections, and this is before term limits were imposed on the number of times a president could run for the presidency. And, Roosevelt, anyone running against Roosevelt would have had a really tough sledding in 1944. And I think that's probably why the Republicans gave grace to Dewey, in 1948. So I will hazard that he got closer against Truman, but that's a good question, and it's one that'd be relatively easy to look up.
And then this is one of our very intellectual friends who visits, was asking for the name of the book that was written. The way they said it was The Ousted Reporter. And I asked if they could clarify who they were speaking about, and they said it was the name was either Maloney or Henning.
Let's see, the reporter was, that was Henning. That's the fellow who Trohan replaced as the Washington bureau chief. Did I misspeak? Perhaps I misspoke, but it was Henning.
Perfect. So what was the name of the book that reporter had wrote? Was their question.
Trohan's book was Political Animals. That was Trohan's book. I'm not aware of a book that Henning wrote.
Cool. I think that's what they were looking for. They said thank you, so I'm assuming that we gave them the right information.
Okay, no, I'm sorry. Maybe I misunderstood the question. I apologize.
No, you're totally fine. If that wasn't the answer, I'm pretty sure this person knows how to get a hold of me. No, okay. They're saying no, it was perfect. We're good.
Okay.
I was going to say they can reach out to me and I can reach out to you.
Absolutely, please do. Sure.
I had a question, honestly, and it was why do you think, or do we know why Life magazine wasn't dragged for misquoting who the president was? Like, I've heard of Dewey Defeats Truman before even working here, and like, why was this one such a big deal?
I think it's such a big deal. It's a very good question, just because of the format. You have a very big, bold, confident headline. The Life magazine one, it's almost kind of buried in the lower corner. It's a little bit more smaller print. You have to almost squint to read it. but it is on the front page of the front cover of Life. But the Tribune one really speaks confidence, and it's very few words. It's 3 words. It's not a long headline like the one on the Life magazine. So, and I think it's also because the President of the United States is holding the newspaper.
Mhm.
If the President of the United States was holding up a copy of Life magazine showing that, I think it would have some traction, but it doesn't have the same kind of power, and because it is such a confident, short,
Yeah.
strong, large print headline, not upside down, unlike the column on the right.
Column. We have another 2 questions actually about the Life magazine. Do we know exactly when that would have come out? Like when did that hit like newsstands and shelves? And was there a printer strike for Life too? Did that affect how they had misquoted, just like how the Tribune had?
I'm not aware of a printer strike at Life. That's a good question, because you might say, well, they really didn't have the excuse that the Tribune would have. And it came out on the eve of the election. I'm not sure the exact date. Yeah.
Oh,
So
you
it
know
came
what?
out.
I was
Yeah.
going to say one
Someone
of
know?
our friends just popped up that they must have hit up the Google. Roosevelt had 432 electoral votes in 1944 to Dewey's 99. So we got an
Okay.
exact answer there. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Thank you for that. So yeah, he came out much better against Truman, didn't he?
We do have another question, and I almost think I could confidently answer this, but you might know the answer too, because I don't think I have proof. This is again me hazarding a guess, and it makes me laugh. Did Truman and McCormick ever make amends? Now it makes me laugh because I do know of Robert feuding with people and making some form of amends. He had a small feud with Winston Churchill, and they seem to have made amends. He had feuded with Henry Ford, and they made amends. But I feel like he wouldn't have made amends with Truman.
No, I've never seen any indication of that, either publicly or privately. We have an extensive post-presidential papers collection at the Truman Library. Truman served well, after he left office in 1953, he lived almost 20 more years. I've never seen any correspondence between the 2 men, or anything that hints of a reconciliation.
And it looks like those are all of our questions. Everyone got in. We got them all answered, which I love. I love that we were able to hit up everybody's questions. We even got one of mine, which is great. Some lovely feedback. They've really enjoyed the lecture.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I see some things in the Q&A, Chris. I guess you probably caught those already. I didn't open them, but
yeah, some of these are just like general comments.
Okay, super. Well, thank you all very much. I sure appreciate the invitation. It's a lot of fun and an honor to speak with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm going to be respectful of everyone's time. So we said we were only going to keep you for an hour. So I will release you into the great wide open again. Oh, you know what? One more fast question for you, Sam. And I'm assuming this is about you. If it's not, it could be about us too. And it's, do you know when you will open again?
No, I wish I knew the answer to that. I will say we're confident of reopening soon. And for updates, I would encourage you to check our website, which is Truman Library. That's one word, trumanlibrary.gov. So trumanlibrary.gov for updates. And you can also, check our social media outlets, Facebook and Twitter.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys so much.
Come visit us. Come see us sometime.
And thank
Illinois
you so
is not
much,
that
Sam.
far.
And everyone go see Sam and go see his museum. As a big thank you for coming and spending this evening with us. So I'm going to let you get on with the rest of your night, Sam. And thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. Have a great evening, everybody.